Three, two, one.
Hi guys, I'm Brooklyn. I'm here with Kevin and Maria. We're going to be
Hello.
talking about opioids in the brain, the neurobiological changes across sobriety, intoxication, and withdrawal.
Awesome. To start off, we're going to go over our presentation highlights. So we're going to talk about opioids, what they are, how they work, what they do in the brain. We're going to compare a sober state, a state that's high, and then also the withdrawal state, how these brain changes lead to cravings and relapse, how they affect memory, physical and cognitive changes, as well as their long-term impacts like dependence, tolerance, and brain aging. And we're going to show you guys our 3D model and why all of this knowledge matters to the work that we do.
Great. So this quote from Costin and George, addiction reflects persistent change in the brain systems involved in reward, stress, and self-regulation rather than a failure of willpower really sets the tone for a whole presentation. What they're saying is that addiction isn't about someone lacking willpower. It's about real lasting changes in the brain, especially in the systems that control reward, stress, and self-control. So it helps us explain why behaviors like craving or relapse happen and reminds us that these behaviors are brain driven, not moral failures. Keeping this perspective helps us approach clients with more empathy and use evidence based trauma informed care instead of judgment.
So let's talk about what opioids are. So they were originally arrived from poppy, and that's the opium, and they were used medically to treat pain. However, they soon found out that it also created an intense euphoria. So users were reporting that it numbed emotional pain as well. This led to a high abuse potential. And then throughout the years, the opium has become synthesized, semi-synthesized, and created in many different forms. So due to this, it's there's just a lot of different schedule classes, pharmacological properties, as well as half-life and dosing. We did find a lot of issues trying to pinpoint specific doses. So for dosing, overdose and lethal dose, it's going to vary from every different type of opioid, um, every type of user. And there's also a lot of factors, including tolerance, the purity of the opioid. If you're getting it from the streets, it might not be completely pure. So it doesn't matter what tolerance you have, it can become lethal if you don't know what's in it. Um, there's also polysubstance use that can lead to lethality. So this is if you take opioids with any other depressants, such as alcohol or benzodiazepines, it can become lethal pretty quickly. And different health conditions also play into what would create an overdose or a lethal dose of opioids.
Awesome. Here we're going to talk about what happens when opioids enter the body and reach the brain. So opioids are lipid soluble, so that means that they can cross the blood-brain barrier very efficiently. So according to our research, this property allows opioids to reach the central nervous system very rapidly after use. Some opioids cross faster than others. For example, heroin crosses the blood-brain barrier faster than morphine, which explains it's one of the reasons it has such a high addiction and overdose risk. Once opioids enter the brain, they bind primarily to the mu opioid receptors or MORS. These receptors are highly concentrated in areas that are involved with pain, reward, and survival, and they include the brainstem, thalamus, ventral tegmental area, and the nucleus accumbens. Mu opioid receptors are G protein coupled receptors, so that means that when they're activated, they don't just turn a neuron on or off, they actually change how the neuron communicates. Specifically, more activation inhibits adenyl cyclase, which reduces cyclic AMP, and this leads to suppressed neurotransmitter release. At the same time, opioids hyperpolarize neurons and they increase potassium outflow and decrease calcium inflow. In simple terms, this makes neurons much less likely to fire. So why is this important? Opioids quickly reach the brain and they hijack its messaging systems. They block pain and produce a boost of dopamine, which makes the user feel a very intense high.
Okay, this slide shows what the brain looks like when it's functioning on non-opioid influenced regulated state. Starting here is important because it gives us a baseline to compare against intoxication and withdrawal. And again, according to Costin and George, in the sober brain, the reward system is balanced and responsive to natural reinforcers like food, social connection, accomplishment, and safety. And dopamine is released in appropriate amounts in a response to meaningful stimuli, okay, not artificially triggered surges. In this state, several neurotransmitters are working together. Dopamine supports motivation and reward anticipation, where GABA provides an inhibitory control and emotional calm. Glutamate supports learning and memory. And research shows that this balance allows the brain to regulate emotion, behavior, and decision making effectively. Another key point is that the body produces its own opioids and endorphins, which are released naturally by natural things like exercise, human connection, as well as pain relief. And according to Inaba and Cohen, these endogenous opioids work within a tightly regulated system and do not overwhelm the brain the way external opioids do. So clinically, this slide helps us understand what we're trying to help clients move towards. Example, a brain that can experience pleasure, regulate emotion, and make decisions about without artificial stimulation. It also helps explain why after opioid exposure, returning to these state can take time because the brain has adapted to a very different chemical environment.
So during intoxication, the opioids bind to the mu receptors in the nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area, and the periaqueductal gray. This binding inhibits the GABA interneurons, causing an uncontrolled dopamine surge. The prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and amygdala become hypoactive. This leads to a drop in impulse control, decision making, threat detection, and memory formation.
So now we're going to look at the intoxication neurotransmitter and pathway changes. So this is a way to view all of the different states, sober, intoxicated, and withdrawal states in a visual manner. So in the sober brain, things are pretty balanced. Natural endorphins are working, dopamine and GABA are regulated, norepinephrine levels are stable, and the stress system is relatively calm. When opioids enter the brain, they suppress inhibitory control in the reward system, which allows dopamine to spike in the nucleus accumbens. That's where the euphoria and reinforcement come from. At the same time, pain signaling drops, norepinephrine decreases, breathing slows, and emotional reactivity is dampened, which can feel like relief or numbness. And then during withdrawal, the brain swings in the opposite direction. So norepinephrine surges, dopamine drops, pain sensitivity increases, and stress circuits in the amygdala become overactive. And then to talk about withdrawal a little bit more in depth, basically what our research has shown is that it's one of the most powerful things that drives the continued use of opioids and also contributes to relapse. So withdrawal isn't just about feeling uncomfortable, it reflects major stresses related to changes in the brain. So when opioids are removed, mu opioid receptors are no longer being stimulated, the brain rebounds in an opposite direction of intoxication. Systems that were suppressed become overactive, especially those involved in stress and arousal. So one of the key areas involved is the locus coeruleus. Research shows that during withdrawal, this region releases a large amount of norepinephrine, which leads to symptoms like anxiety, agitation, sweating, tremor, and insomnia, which helps explain why withdrawal often feels very overwhelming and hard to tolerate. Um, and and at the same time, the prefrontal cortex is also less effective during withdrawal. So, clinically, this is important to consider why people in withdrawal may appear a little restless or distressed. And so, those are important things to consider.
Thanks, Maria. Okay, so this slide pulls everything together by visually comparing how the brain functions across sober, intoxicated, as well as withdrawal states. The goal here is to synthesize showing these biologically conditions, distinct conditions are not just different moods of levels of motivation. In a sober brain, research shows relatively balanced functioning across systems. Executive functioning is intact. The reward pathway responds to natural reinforcers. our emotions are regulated, and arousal and brain perception are within a normal range. During intoxication, we see a very different pattern. Reward signaling is exaggerated, judgment and inhibition are impaired, emotional reactivity is dampened, and breathing is suppressed. While during withdrawal, the brain shifts again, but this time into a high stress state. Research from Kaplan and Thompson shows increased activation of stress circuits, especially involving the amygdala and locus coeruleus, alongside reduced dopamine signaling. The combination leads to anhedonia, cravings, agitation, insomnia, even poor impulse control. So what's important clinically here is that withdrawal is not a return to baseline. Even though respiratory drive may normalize, the brain remains hypersensitive to stress and cues, which increase relapse vulnerability. This slide helps explain why relapse often occurs during withdrawal. The brain is under intense stress, reward is blunted, and decision-making capacity is reduced, all at the same time, which understanding this helps us frame relapse risk as a predictable neurobiological outcome, not a personal failure.
So for the cognitive and behavioral effects, a lot of it is related to the damage that chronic opioid use does to the prefrontal cortex. So this damage leads to poor impulse control, planning, and judgment. This also relates to poor emotional regulation. The dopamine systems adapt to the manufactured surges that opioids create. This causes a lack of interest in any natural rewards. And a big consequence of this is a lot of social withdrawal. You're not getting as much pleasure from meeting with friends and family and a lot of natural rewards.
Yeah, so to talk about this a little bit more deeply, we can talk about the cognitive, physiological, and behavioral effects of opioid use. So cognitively, opioids impair attention, working memory, and executive function. Physiologically, tissue dependent, so tolerance leads to increased dosing. So tissue dependence causes those physical withdrawal when opioids are removed. Developmental effects, opioid exposure during adolescence disrupts brain development, which is why it's especially dangerous during this time period. And behaviorally and socially, users may show social withdrawal, apathy, increase in conflict, impair emotional regulation. And what this means for us clinically is that opioid use disorder affects how people think, how they feel, how they function. And so recovery often involves rebuilding cognitive and emotional skills in order to support our clients.
Okay, so this slide focuses on what happens over time with repeated opioid exposure. The key idea here is that the brain doesn't just return to normal once the drug wears off. It adapts, and those adaptations can last well beyond active use. First thing we'll look at is tolerance, and according to Kostin and George, tolerance develops as opioid receptors become less responsive after repeated activation. So what this means is the same doses produce less effect, which often leads people to increase their dosing, obviously. Clinically, this increases an overdose risk, especially when someone returns to previously tolerated dose after a period of abstinence. Next is dependence. Research shows that dependence occurs when the brain adjusts to the constant presence of opioids. When opioids are removed, the brain can't maintain equilibrium, which leads to withdrawal symptoms. Importantly, dependence is a physiological process, not a sign of addiction by itself, but strongly reinforces continued use because people are trying to avoid withdrawal rather than seeking pleasure. They're just trying to stay well. Over time, opioids also affect the brain's reward system more broadly. According to Monica et al., repeated opioid use reduces dopamine signaling and sensitivity to natural rewards. This makes everyday activities feel less pleasurable and can contribute to emotional numbness and low motivation, even during abstinence. This slide helps explain why recovery can take time. Even after someone stops using opioids, their brain may still be working through these adaptations. That's why long-term treatment, cognitive support, and realistic expectations are essential parts of recovery-oriented care.
Here is our visual representation. So you can see the sober brain has a normal amount of dopamine. The intoxicated brain has a surge of up to 200% more manufactured dopamine. And then the withdrawal, the dopamine that is in the brain is really dull and blunted, relating to less pleasure, like hitting the less pleasure reward centers. And then next slide, Kevin. So for our treatment plan, everything comes from NADAC. So they talk about the importance of MAT, so medically assisted therapy, treatment for opioid use disorder. This is using synthetic opioids that kind of help the withdrawal symptoms. But they also talk about how important it is to not rely on MAT and how important it is to have different modalities of clinical applications that all need to work cohesively together with a professional to deliver this treatment. And then these are our sources. This is where we got everything for this presentation throughout all three parts. Thanks, guys.
Thank
Okay, thanks
you.
everybody.